And Mark, I'm gonna turn it over to you.
Okay, sounds great. And hopefully everybody will see my screen. I can proceed as soon as that comes up. There we go. Okay, well, glad to be in Franklin and Warren County, some of my favorite counties in the state. When I came to NC State years ago, Franklin County was one of the counties I was trained in. So I was asking about Bill Lord, and back in the early 80s, he was my mentor. And Warren County was my playground. So we got to learn about deer hunting up there. So special place to my heart. And then when I got out of college, I worked for two Masons who were based in Warren County. So we built plenty of houses here in the Raleigh area, and I learned a lot working with those guys. We had one of the most educated labor forces for a masonry crew, because I had many of my friends who just graduated from NC State with master's degrees working as laborers. So hopefully those houses will stand the test of time. So Matthew, if you keep admitting folks, I will try to get this slide presentation to move forward. There we go. So what I'd like to talk to you about today is what present use value is about, how it works, tell you about deferred taxes, that while you're in the program, you're going to benefit from a lesser amount of taxes than the true value on your property. But that can turn around at any time, and there's a small penalty, which can amount to a large penalty over time, and we'll talk about that. I've actually gotten a hold of the 2021 forestry PUV rates. This one focuses on Franklin County, but as you'll see, Warren and Franklin are in the same Piedmont area, so the rates will not change. Your tax rate at the local county level may be a little different. So we'll actually go through some examples of how to calculate what that tax rate would be. And if you're familiar with your tax card, all that information is there, and you can figure it out, or with Matthew's help or Martha's help, we can help you calculate that. So we'll talk about why PUV matters. And then, since I neglected to remember this was a two-county effort, I'm going to present Franklin County's numbers. They'll probably be a little bit more powerful than Warren's, but the impact will be similar. And then we'll wrap up with, we can take really questions at any time. So this is a small enough group that if you have a question, just put it in the chat, or I think you could turn your microphone on and stop me, and we'll answer it right then and there. But whatever works for you, it's a small group, and I'm glad to talk or stop or answer a question. I think that will be the most useful. So the nature of this program, and North Carolina was an early leader with this idea. We had one of the first laws to put it in place, and it came about because we were losing a lot of green space or working lands, whether it's tree covered or crop covered, or some of the horticultural crops we'll see. Folks were getting taxed out of actual production because their land was getting too valuable. And so that's the fit of this program. And the basic notion behind it is we should only be taxing that land and its ability to produce a crop or income from that crop. So for trees, that's going to be a harvest somewhere down the line. For pulpwood or saw timber or some other product. For cropland, it's whatever that land can produce, and that's all based on the soil's productivity. So if we want to get into the weeds later, I can explain about some of that. But for the income estimates, a lot of it is based on what that land is renting for at this current time. Many people are enrolled in the program early on at the tax office, but it's a voluntary program. So as land changes hands or people acquire more tracts, if the lands they acquired were not in the program previously, they'll have to roll those in and apply for them. And we'll talk about dates and how all that's done. I'm assuming that many of you, if you have agricultural land, are considering this program or already enrolled. And at the end, hopefully you'll see that it's an economic boon to be a part of this program if your intent is to actively manage your land. So let's talk a little bit about how the program works. You might be able to see me on the screen. We kind of know what land is selling for in the area, especially if it's being cut up into house lots, or maybe a whole farm has sold recently. And you kind of know what an acre of land might be worth. If not, check your tax card and you'll get an idea of what the tax man thinks your land is worth. But where the deferred taxes come in is that there's a gap between what the land is worth in the marketplace and perhaps what its productive capacity is in the agricultural or forestry realm. And so that difference is what we end up putting on the shelf, or it gets deferred until such time as you come out of the program. So I use the words, it's put on the shelf. The tax people don't forget it. And actually the difference is on your tax card. So you can see that tangibly when that comes out every year. So there are 3 ways to qualify for the program: agriculture, forestry, and horticulture. And we know really since the 80s, a lot of cropland in Franklin came out through the CRP program, was put into forestry. So agriculture switched to forestry lands, but both of them are qualified uses of the property. So it never left present use valuation. And in many cases, the value of it could have dropped. And we'll see that sometimes the agricultural value of lands may be 3 times what the forestry rate will be. And we'll show you how to calculate that and where those numbers come from. Horticulture is the easiest way to get in the program in terms of a small property, but it's also one of the highest taxed of the 3 land uses that qualify. And I'll show you those rates, the 2021 rates. And when I say 2021, we haven't reached that year, but the next time properties are revalued, in the year that they're revalued, we step up to the newest tax. They call it a schedule, but essentially it's the tax rates that will be used during that whole cycle of between this renewal and the next update of tax changes. So if you're on a 4-year cycle, some counties are, or an 8-year cycle, those taxes will be locked in for that whole period until the next update. So how do you get into this program? It sounds like a winner for many people. So if you've owned the property for 4 years, or you don't have to own it that long, as long as you reside on the property, you can qualify when you apply in typically the listing period, which in most counties is the month of January. The bills for taxes usually roll out about March or April, so that gives them time to update your tax card, and that's that early filing period, is January of each year. But there are components in the program that say, excuse me, that if you apply in a timely manner, that will qualify too. So if you recently purchased a property or it's outside that January window, you can apply at that time. Excuse me. So we'll get into the acreage and ownership requirements on the next slide. But it's important to remember that there are some distinctions in how you use the land and how you qualify for the program. For agriculture and horticulture, you've got to have an income stream that averages $1,000 gross over a 3-year period. So each year you're shooting to meet that minimum $1,000 amount, but one year you may have a loss and go below that amount. The hope and the way you qualify is to have an average minimum of $1,000 per acre per year. That's for ag and horticulture. In forestry, because we don't sell timber that frequently, in many cases it may be once or 3 times in a landowner's ownership lifetime. It's the forest management plan that qualifies you for the program. So income is not required the way it is for agriculture and horticulture, but the forestry plan is. And we'll talk about sound management, what needs to be in a management plan for forestry. But that's a lot of the work that consultants and the NC Forest Service would be doing for you to get you to qualify. So there are 4 tests in the law based on ownership. And over time, that's where most of the changes come in the program, as we have established trust to protect farmland, forest land, or LLCs or business type partnerships. As long as those are family owned or actively managed by the owners, then those type of ownerships qualify. The acreage is where some people come right to the edge but don't have enough land to qualify. And this would be largely the case for maybe horticultural producers or new farmers that are just getting grub stake. And this is something to keep in mind. So 5 acres is the minimum for horticulture, 5 acres in actual production. Agriculture is in the middle, 10-acre minimum. So that could be pasture land, it could be row crops, any combination of things. And then 20 acres in actual production. And this is where folks get into potential trouble as they pass on. If they're leaving a larger tract to multiple heirs, you want to devise a plan so that you meet these minimum acreage requirements, or your heirs will. Otherwise, they'll get hit with a surprising bill they never saw coming. So if you keep above these minimum numbers, then your heirs can stay in the program. And as I mentioned earlier, income for those first 2 programs, horticulture and agriculture, are $1,000 per year on average for a 3-year period. And as I mentioned earlier, no income requirement for forestry, but all of those uses, including forestry, have a clause in there to prove sound management. For ag and horticulture, that's largely proven by income, but there are other ways, I think 6 or 7 ways you can prove sound management through a management plan, through an agency person saying you're soundly managing the land. There are many details in the law related to that, but for today's purposes, we'll talk largely about the forest management plan as the qualifier for forest lands. So everybody likes to talk about the bottom line. What is this? The bottom line? What will we be forced to pay on forest land in Franklin or Warren counties? And these are the Piedmont rates. I didn't update my slide, but this is for 2021, and they shift about $1 or $2 per year, so it's not a drastic change. Part of my job here at NC State is to calculate these numbers each year, and they rise and fall based on stumpage prices for the year, relative costs. So I think between 20 and 21, that first category, which is the highest productive forest land, and that's where many properties will fall, it's between $365 to $364, I think was the change this year. So $1 change, and some of the others have dropped $1 or $2 or $5. So what does that mean relative to the fair market value? Matthew, you might want to weigh in. What is forest land cost in Warren County these days? Is it in the $2,000 or $3,000 range?
You're looking anywhere from, I mean, I saw some recently at $1,600 an acre up to up to like 3,500. It just depends on where it is in the county.
Right. And who the buyers are, if it's being bought for recreational hunting land or whatever, or tract size is going to impact that.
Yeah. And
But
we
you
still have
could,
quite a few tracts in Warren County owned by, well, I don't know if they're still international paper, but a lot of them are still owned by big paper mills.
okay, so timber investment management organizations or the, the companies themselves. So that's the big potential savings from $1,500 to on the low end, if that's the fair market value, um, to this $364. So what does that mean to your bottom line? I went and went ahead and got the tax rates for Franklin this year. I don't think the next year's rates will be out yet. But if you live out in the county, it's going to be based on 80 cents per $100 of value. That's called the mill rate. So we're going to take that number or a combination of those numbers. You can see that if you live outside in the rural areas, there'll be a fire tax of a few cents. But that dark column on the right gives you an idea of what the fire tax and the countywide tax would be for someone living out in the countryside nearby. So we're going to say 88 cents per $100 of value. And let's see what shows up. And we're going to use the rates based on the Piedmont area. That's the 136, the major land resource area. So the whole state, as you can see, is grouped into five or six major categories that the tax rate is based on that productivity of the land by that geographic region, but also by its productivity within that region, because soils across the landscape vary in their productivity. And so this 6 geographic regions for forestry, 5 different productivity classes is where we get our rate schedule. And so Warren County would be just up the road from there, but it's all brown too. And so it all qualifies under that Piedmont rating. So I told you about the good parts of the program. You can see that, at least in the example above, that if Matthew's right, the lowest property in Warren County may be $1,500 or twice that, then our tax rate in this program would be a fifth or maybe as small as a tenth of its fair market value. So quite a bit of savings, 80, 90% we see on average and maybe more so in a more developed county. So you're going to qualify for that rate as long as you have a forest management plan or the income stream and you can prove the crops came off the land when asked by the program managers. And you have your taxes deferred that large amount as long as you keep it in that land use. But if it comes out voluntary or involuntarily through condemnation or some other purpose, or those taxes become due. And so they're going to ask for the differential. We talked about the break between the fair market value and the deferred rate. That gap in the middle comes due for the past 3 years, plus this year's amount at fair market value, plus an interest payment for that 3 years ago tax bill is going to have a 9 or 10% rate on it for the last 36 months. Then your bill from 2 years ago is going to have 24 months of interest. Last year's bill will have 12 months of interest, and there'll be no interest on this year's, but they're all due immediately and that full amount. And that's the one, if you came on early, Matthew was talking about the heart attack a friend had essentially when they got that tax bill. And the reason we talk about estate planning hand in hand when we talk about this program is that our duration on this world is unknown. And so we want to make plans for if we're blessed with acreage like this, to have a transition plan for our kids and not to leave them with that tax bill. So tell them that you're in the forest present use value program. Let them know what the penalties might be, and then come up with a plan so that they can receive the property in total, either through an LLC or separate tracts, uh, but still qualify for the program. And there's a 60-day window after that transfer or post-mortem where the tax office needs to be contacted. The same would go for the purchase of a new tract of land. You want to let them know what your intentions are, because those taxes are going to come due either during a timber sale or an estate settlement. And that's a shock you don't want to subject your heirs to. So
Mark, we did have a question pop up in
okay,
the chat box.
let's stop and do that then.
Melanie asks us, how do they determine the interest rate as far as the deferred taxes when it comes due?
Okay, that's set. I think it may be 10% for the first year. It might be by, it's not necessarily by law, but by the rulemaking process at Department of Revenue. So it doesn't necessarily fluctuate the way interest rates would. You know, we're down, the interest rate market is pretty low these days. It's not, I don't know that it ever drops below that 9 or 10% rate. So I don't have the specifics on that, but the Department of Revenue does set that rate.
Mark, I have a question.
Okay,
Martha,
Martha,
how
how
you
are
doing
you?
today?
I am
Um,
well.
Suppose these farmers are getting older and they decide to rent out their farm, but they might get at least $1,000 in rent money for that land. Can they still keep their farm in present use value? Just say it's such as boarding horses or
Okay,
renting it out the land. I'm gonna mute myself now.
okay. So that's a great question, Martha. And what qualifies a homeowner or a farm owner in this instance for the program is not so much the rental payments. This is a production oriented program. So they're more interested in the value of the crops coming off the property. So in the case of a rental, you may get 75 or more dollars per acre per year in the rental. That's not what's going to qualify for the program. It's going to be the round bales of hay that are produced, or the calves. Maybe you have a cow-calf operation, and so the calves are sold each year. So if your land is producing, 2 or 3 calves, whatever that would be needed to get you above that $1,000 amount, that's crucial. That's more what the tax office is looking for. So I hope
So
that
that would
answers your
be
question.
the person that leased the land.
But
Their production would count toward that, right?
yes, that's what's important. So and you asked about boarding horses and the like. That's gone back and forth, and there's been a precedent set that if you're adding value by training the horses, not just boarding them, but adding value to producing a foal or taking a run-of-the-mill quarter horse and adding value to them by training, that qualifies, but not necessarily the boarding itself, because that's considered you may be able to board on land that isn't in actual production. But let's say boarding is in addition to haymaking operation. And so the boarding may take place on, let's say, 1 or 2 of those acres, but you're still producing enough hay that would qualify you in the production figure. That's why you have to get into the nuances for that. So I can't say black or white, they'll always qualify, because the precedent has been set with the horse training. So it's not the boarding, and it's not, so if a farmer has a viable contracting business where they're doing work for other farmers, it's not the income that they're making off the farm that qualifies it. It's the actual production on the farm. So on your farm, for instance, you're producing cows, and it's the cows that qualify you, whether you rent out that land or you own it yourself. Does that help?
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Any questions like that? I'm glad to tackle. And next week, I actually work with Department of Revenue, and I help train them not just on this program, but on forestry and what to look for in a plan. So they're one of my strongest audiences, and I'll be talking to them from home, which I miss seeing them in person because it's typically 100 people in a nice hotel somewhere, often at the beach, sometimes in Cherokee, but usually in Greensboro. So let's look at that forestry schedule, and I don't want to play favorites to forestry, but I'll start there. If we go back to the numbers, and this is what the whole rate schedule looks like for the essentially west to east. The lowest number, 130, is in the mountains. The highest number at the bottom would be lower coastal plain, and the Piedmont is right there in the middle. You can see that the Piedmont and the Sandhills have some of the highest rates, tax rates in the state, not because where they're located, but because of the markets and the type of production needed, the lower cost, for instance, of spraying and planting versus bedding and a bunch of other things. But anyway, let's look at that $365, multiply it by the tax rate. Well, I guess we'll end up doing that at the end, but so that's our tax rate. We're going to say on the highest productivity. I'll put a little arrow there to show you what I'm talking about. Your best land in the Piedmont, 365. We multiply it by that 88 cents or so from our land ownership, or the tax for Franklin County for somebody living outside the city of Dunn or the town of Dunn, but in the town of Bunn, but also in the Bunn Fire District. That's going to amount to a $3.21 bill or 22-cent bill each year on each acre of forest land you have. We go through agriculture. Your best class land in agriculture is going to be close to $1,000 of value. And so for an acre of that land, we're close to $880, right? If it was $1,000 even, then we'd owe $8.80 on our agricultural land. Make sense? And if you had land in that medium productive class, it would be about 2/3 of that, or maybe $6.60 per acre, $6.60. And then if we're not going to do a lot of math here, but on your lowest quality land, maybe it's the rockiest or the wettest or least productive. If your land is classed like that, it's going to be about half of that $880, closer to $4.40 per acre per year. And so across the farm, for instance, you may have 1/3 of it in each class. You may have all of it in the best class. And that's going to be set at the county level based on the soils beneath there and the quality of their GIS capabilities. And finally, let's look at horticulture for a minute, and we'll go through that same exercise. We went from 300 to 1,000, and now horticulture rates on the best land is much, much higher. You see in the mountains, it's almost double that. This is the oftentimes the flat land where most of our tomatoes are grown. If you've been out to the mountains in the summertime and seen those lush fields, that land rents for a very high rate compared to the Piedmont. So the tax bill on this for that, again, that fictitious or hypothetical tract outside of the town of Dunn in the countryside, but in the fire district, would be closer to $12.90, I think is what I figured it yesterday, on your best land. and then, you know, reduced almost in half on the lowest land. And again, what I was using as an example from that is the countywide tax in Franklin, plus a fire district. And that's exclusive of your recycling or disposal fees. Do you see how that works? Now, if you happen to live in one of the towns, 5 towns listed here, you know, your tax rate can be considerably higher. Almost double outside of Franklinton, almost double outside of, inside of Youngsville. And that's a function of the tax, the services you receive being an in-county versus a in-county type person. Does that help? It's a little more detailed than I get into, but I think it helps when you see how the how that tax bill is calculated, and to see that it's being done right in your case. All right, so when you get to see a pretty picture, that means we're going to transition into something else. So I can pause here if there are any questions about the tax. I mean, taxes aren't exciting too much, but it's nice to know how they're calculated and the valuation takes place. But since they come annually, they're like gas prices at the pump. You know what it is, you anticipate them, and it seems like a big burden. That's where PUV comes into play, and it's most useful in that it lowers the tax and keeps you in productive management of that land. Okay, I talked to you a little bit about how the plan qualifies you for forest land, but any acre that's in PUV has to be soundly managed. And what it means, at least in the law, it's the greatest net return from the land consistent with its conservation and long-term improvement. So they're not expecting, as early agriculture was like in the development of our country, where you wore out a farm. We don't want that. We want sustainable farming. So the returns have to be consistent with what the land can produce. So that means rotation, crop rotation. It means a lot of the conservation tillage practices and whatever we've learned in these 200 plus years as a nation, or 100 years since extension's been around, trying to help you improve that. So greatest net return. It's not about spending a lot of money or going broke. It's about what's reasonable and consistent, and can keep you sustainable over time, although that language isn't here. Conservation is kind of the guidepost here. So in a forestry plan, which is the qualifier for that forestry land, this is what the tax clerks are looking for, and they're obligated to look for or look through or review the forest plans, at least an eighth of them each year, because 8 years is kind of the renewal cycle for tax updates. But if you're in a county like Wake, I think we do it on a 4-year cycle, so they'd be needing to look at a quarter of those properties each year. Mecklenburg County around Charlotte, I think they have a annual update of their tax rates. So they'd be obligated to look at each and every one of those PUV tracts each year. So we want to know, or they're looking for, that you're managing the land for commercial timber production. That's how you qualify. They want to know where it is, and today's mapping and photography of the tracts are better and more accessible than they've ever been. You can go on your county website and learn more about your tract than you ever thought was possible, and is already out there, including what you're paying for it on taxes the last time it turned over. Some of them, if you have a house property, it details the last time one of the appraisers stepped foot on your property, or if you added a new wing to your house or an addition. They've documented all that. So they want to know what's out there when the plan was created. and where you're headed with management recommendations. And then because they're anticipating you're in it for timber production in a sustainable manner, they want to know when it's going to be cut and what are your plans for putting it back in production. So some of the counties differ on this, but one of them out in the central Piedmont wants trees in the ground by January 1st or that month of January to make sure it's in actual production. So if you harvest it in the fall, there's an anticipation that you're going to have trees in the ground when they come check it in the first of the year. So that's pretty stringent. Others just want to know, what are your plans? Is nature going to seed the next crop, or are you going to sow it by hand, planting seedlings or the like? So, and they even want to get the specifics in there. You know, we're going to plant loblolly or longleaf, or we're going to use natural regeneration or seed tree, something like that. So they've gotten pretty savvy, and they can tell a plan that's blowing smoke and one that follows these things, because they've got a checklist and they're looking for all of them. And it's got to make sense. And the harvest is kind of the end of the line for when a crop is ready to go. And so they want to know when that's going to be with reasonable harvest windows, and then how it's going to be replaced. So I do a lot of work with the Department of Revenue, 2 trainings a year, but I also get to review some of the plans that they have questions with. And you can, after you see a few plans, you get a pretty good handle on who's skirting by the requirements, and then who's really in it for the production mode. So these are the folks that can help. You know, Forest Service employee on the right, consultant on the left, land manager in the middle. And I'm taking the picture after an ice storm or a wind event. So things happen, and the plans aren't static. They're not written in stone. They've got to change for the conditions. So this wind event led to, or ice and wind together, led to a unscheduled harvest. And that's part of the plan, part of the management that takes place. So things change, but work gets done, and we move on. So just as I was mentioning, that update that plan as conditions change. I was reading this morning, we're going to have our 24th tropical storm or named storm Delta this week. So things change a lot and more rapidly than we've known. And if you lived out west, you'd be battling the fires today. That's going to be a major landscape change. So a timetable for reevaluating, maybe after 10 years or whatever your standard plan is. But just to reiterate, and I put it in underlined here, that what they're really looking for in that plan on the first page, and the intent of the ownership, is that trees are going to leave the land, trees of value commercially. Now improvements could be made by the landowner themselves, excuse me a minute, can be made by the landowner themselves to do thinning and firewood removal to improve the stand that they have. But ultimately, they're looking for timber to leave the property. Now, it can be made into boards and used on the farm. That's fine. There's a value associated with that. But the idea is that something of value is going to go into the marketplace and keep that deferred money, tax money, circulating through the economy, and that the general public will be better for it. And it's okay to manage your land for other purposes, wildlife or water quality, or you name it, beauty, enjoyment, recreation. But that timber's got to be part and parcel to it. It can be a longer rotation than the timber companies that Matthew talked about. It could be shorter if that makes sense. And it can switch among those 3 categories of PUV. So if, for instance, half of the farm is in agriculture, but prices are better or you want to expand operations, some of that timberland could come in. But again, it still must meet the agricultural income requirements. And so this is where some people come into problems. So if they have agricultural land, not enough of it to meet that income requirement, or they put in a peach orchard or a vineyard, there's going to be some startup time where that acreage cannot qualify. So if the property is large enough, it's not an issue. But if it's a small tract and you're going all into horticultural production, you might have those 4 or 5 gap years until you have some income, or 3 years income enough to qualify for the program. So that's the only place that it really gets sticky. And just like Martha's question earlier, the devil is in the details. But switching from agriculture to forestry is a no-brainer because the income requirement goes out. And so as we look back to the 80s, when a lot of Franklin went out of Franklin Ag Land went into the CRP program, then there were 10 years of program payments. And so the agricultural lands qualified as long as they were in a government program. So this program is flexible enough for that. And then ultimately, when the trees were in the ground, the use switched to forestry and there was no income requirement. So that was a good one. For the agricultural lands that came out of production but received the tobacco settlement payments, for those 10 years or more that they got the program payments, that land still qualified. So that was a concern for our extension staff when just to make sure people still qualified for PUV once those program payments ended. And that means either leasing it, as in the case of Martha's question, or where the other producer could qualify the program, but just having the farmers solvent enough so that they can keep the land afterwards and not jump into that higher tax burden and suffer a minor heart attack when they saw that bill. Okay, so another image shows that we can have a mixture of forestry, cropland, maybe pasture land on the back, whatever works for that property, just meeting the requirements, production requirements. So early on the first slide, I had a line that said, what is the impact here for Franklin County? And I could look up a similar numbers for Warren County when we get to the question and answer period. But this was from fiscal year 19 and 20, the one that I guess we just went through. These are part of the Department of Revenue's obligation is to tell the legislature every year what's transpired, what's real estate land worth in each county by subject class. But at the far end of the table is the impact of the present use program. So in Franklin County, if we looked at all the lands that qualify for PUV, the fair market value, that upper end that we talked about, those lands are worth upwards of $563 million, okay? By enrolling in the program, those green numbers, I'm pointing to them on my screen, but I'll put the cursor there. The numbers in the middle, $451 million, were saved or deferred. So those are taxes not paid by all of you as a part of being in the program. So here was the real tax bill, about a fifth of that total. So 20 cents on the dollar is what you pay when you're in the program on average. So we saw that there's a difference between horticulture, the highest range, agriculture, and forestry. So this is a mix of all those lands. But that's a pretty big savings. And that's why I spend maybe a sixth of my time promoting this program, because it is so crucial. So that's the information related to the present use savings, present use valuation savings. But what's Franklin County's, all of the real estate worth? All the land, all the structures. This forms the tax base of that, of which runs the county. So this is updated every year. But you can see that the savings, or the deferred amount, that green one up here, is just a fraction, or maybe a 1% of what we're seeing here, if I'm doing my math right. So it's not a major hit to the county by any stretch, but the obligation is on the rest of that taxable real estate, whether it's commercial properties, industry properties, or where each of you may live if you're attending from Franklin County today. So big dollars. Most important is that it keeps agriculture and forestry current on the land. The land's in productive use. And as long as people follow, it's a voluntary program, so they've got to apply, got to meet the ownership and income requirements. And I think my next summary slides will say that in a more concise manner than I would if I got to ramble. But for what's in it for you is the reduction of the annual tax bill. And we saw what those rates are like, at least for the best land in the Piedmont. Your tax rate may vary, just like your mileage may vary on your truck or car. But it makes forestry, agriculture, and horticulture, and livestock production, that I haven't forgotten you, all more economical, right? It rewards and ensures sound management by keeping lands productive. And that goes way back to the DNA of when our state was established. The founding fathers, if you will, had it in the laws that land that wasn't productively utilized by its owner could transfer. That's the adverse possession law that still stands. So to have a program that benefits people in production is true to our nature. It rewards commercial, timber production, agriculture production, horticulture production. And it's not a giveaway program, and a lot of new, not county managers necessarily, but county commissioners view it as giveaway, because they look at that big green number, that $450 million, and say, hey, we want some of that. But the truth is, you earn it by keeping your land in actual production. So if I hadn't mentioned it before, in forestry, you need to get a plan. You need to apply. And this includes tracts that you've actually recently purchased, or if you're about to leave it to heirs, make sure they know about these things, the sound management requirements, the acreage requirements. You're going to reap the rewards on an annual basis, and that's worth a pat on the back. In many cases, it's that savings that allows you to stay in production. And maybe it allows you the capital to upgrade or improve your conservation on the land, or your profitability of your operation. So I'm going to take one more drink and then we'll finish up with this slide. And that's a good time to come up with questions. So, the program has been very effective at deferring taxes for landowners and for keeping green space or working space in the landscape. It turns out that this land may actually return your county coffers more profit than housing development would. And we think about what it takes to maintain agricultural land, the Soil and Water Conservation Department, some of the county extension operations, the Forest Service. But that's a whole lot less than building a new school to educate our youth. So it turns out that this green space is actually net benefit to the county coffers in most counties. So you got to be in production. You got to soundly manage it. There's some income requirements exist, but they've been kept pretty low, largely by farm organizations that really want to promote this program. You've got to enroll, and you've got to comply with the program requirements, which is to keep it in agriculture, horticulture, forestry, keep it actively producing. Fill out the paperwork when they ask what's going on the land, what have you been producing. Submit a new updated forest management plan when it's required. Otherwise, you'll face these deferred taxes. If the new owner, if your land transfers, if the new owner agrees to maintain it in PUV and to assume those back 3 taxes, because the department, your tax assessor has the ability to reach back 3 years. That's one of the reasons why they have that 4-year requirement, ownership requirement, so they could legally reach back those years. But those deferred taxes can be substantial. We're talking about 80 cents or 80 cents of your tax burden, $1 tax burden would come due for those previous 3 years plus this year's amount plus interest. So it could be substantial on a big tract. So the applications are due in January, and there's 60 days to update the tax office. And how they find out about land transfers is largely through the deeds office. So if you pass away and the land transfers to your heirs, they're going to be notified. It's electronic. It's done by the computer. They're going to come looking for that tax, deferred tax thing, or an explanation on how that happens. So being in that magic 2-month window is very important. Just be advised that if you're doing the estate planning or you're selling off a tract of land, they're going to be notified there. If the ownership changes in name or type, it's best to advise them what you're up to. Ownership may only change in name, but they're going to view it as an ownership change and come doing their job, pursuing the explanation why. So I thank you. I'm going to take questions and put up my contact information and get one more sip.
Mark, we do have some good questions come through from Luke. He says, hypothetical question. He says, if you have 40 acres and 20 acres of it is wooded and 20 acres of it is in agricultural land, or say 10 of it's agricultural, 10 of it's horticultural, how do you go about dividing the PUV up on one tract of land, or would it all be under one bracket?
Okay, so the beauty of these new mapping programs at the tax office, they're going to be able to do that for you. And actually in your application, it's a multi-form thing, but they're going to ask, of that 40 acres, how much is in woodland, how much is in cropland? So they're going to start your tax bill based on the information you provide, and they'll check it, of course. So there'd be 3 different rates on those acres, but that's very typical. You know, every farm is a little bit different. Some are timber dominated. In many cases, if it's really good land, it's been cleared and it's mostly agriculture. Horticulture really comes into play, you know, operations that specialize in strawberries or farm grown crops, pick your own, be it tomatoes or berries or something like that. By and large, they're not going to get into your business. You're either agriculture or forestry. But if you, a new starting farmer, you may go horticulture because of the returns, and that allows you to be in the program with a smaller acreage. But very good question. And most of that stuff is done, you know, on a parcel by parcel basis. One thing I didn't mention, and it's probably worth doing since we want to throw everything at you today if we can in our first hour, you can bring up to 19 acres of woodland in with a farm operation without a requirement for a plan. But the moment it gets over those 20 acres, that's when they'll want a plan. So in your hypothetical example, you might clear an acre of that woodland if you were nearing that 20-acre thing, if you didn't want to go through the rigmarole of the management plan. Does that make any sense?
And Luke or anybody else has a question, feel free if you want to unmute yourself and ask away or whatever. One question I do have for you, Mark, if you've got farmland that's in a trust, do you need to have it worded somehow or another and whoever's going to be the trustee that they've got the land is in present use value, and how would you handle a situation like that?
Okay, so very important when we have an extension attorney, Andrew Brannon, and his predecessors talked about that. As you're designing, whether it's an LLC or a trust, have its purpose for existence to qualify for one of these or all three of these PUV requirements for the purpose of horticulture, agriculture, or forest production. That's how you get by on this. That's how they qualify.
Okay.
The properties that don't qualify are the ones that you mentioned earlier. A publicly traded timber corporation would have trouble qualifying, or those with the sawmill, not necessarily. It's really how it's owned. Can they trace it back to an individual?
Yeah.
You know, not a post office box or not not a post office draw in Delaware. They want to know there's a live body or a family operation. So it's a program lined up for that. And so we've seen, and you talked about Warren County being owned by commercial timber entities. Many of them have changed their structure so that it may be a group of individuals, or there may be a primary owner of an LLC, so they can qualify at this lower tax rate and be sustainable in that regard. But one of our largest sawmills in the region is still privately owned, and that family qualifies for PUV, which is very unique when you see now their sawmill and other operations will be taxed at the industrial rate, but their forest land qualifies for PUV. So
yeah. Grant put in chat box, he says, if you buy adjacent land to what you already have, can you extend existing PUV to the new land, I guess under the same management plan? He said he has hardwood forestry, and it's got some standard hardwoods.
So yes, with some qualifications. And this works in many areas. Once you have qualified for the program with we call it a parent tract that meets the qualifications for acreage or use, you can bring in smaller tracts that would not qualify, either in the same county or may qualify on their own. You can bring them into an existing operation. The important thing is that they be titled exactly the same. So if it's Mr. Joe A. Jones on the parent tract, the new one can't be Joe A. Jones and wife. You know, they have to be titled exactly the same. So, or it would have to qualify on its own. But yes, the law is written and it's interpreted that we want to make it easy for existing operations to expand and bring in other tracts as the opportunity arises. So manage the same, largely under the same management plan, within 50 acres or in the same county. Bring it on in. Outside of that range, it might have to qualify on its own, or in the instance of just being titled slightly different with a brother or sibling or spouse, it might have to qualify on its own.
But you can do that as long as as you said, like the main track is 20 acres. The main track is 20, but other separate tracks, even if they're not touching it, under 50 acres can be brought in.
Oh, under 50-mile distance. And the only thing is that they had to come up with some metric to see, can it be managed by the same individual reasonably with the same equipment or what have you.
Mm-hmm.
And 50 miles or the same county is what they came up with. So the answer is yes, but with those few qualifications. Probably my answer was longer than you wanted it to be. So. Well, I've enjoyed being with you all. I'm not going to shut you off until Matthew says boo or Martha. But
we've had 2 more questions pop up. If you've got
great.
a few more minutes.
Oh, I mean, this is all I do. I'm at the house.
But Luke says going back to his initial question, say 40 acres and 20 are wood, the other 20 are just vacant land. Does that whole tract qualify for the forestry program, or just the 20 acres that are wood?
Okay, so you're going to be, if it's in agriculture, you're going to have to qualify on agriculture on its own merits. So there'll be no income requirement on the forestry land, but the income requirement will be there on the agricultural land. So it can't really be not in production. So it's got to be producing round bales or some crop that you can claim that $1,000 income from.
Mm-hmm.
And they do spot checks, and with digital photography these days, you can get updated images. Not that people are willing to pay for them, but you can get them every 6 or 8 days. But the Farm Service Agency gets a field flown in their county during the growing season, so that's available. I don't know if that answered the question.
Got another question from Grant. Says, do you get penalized for back taxes if you convert land, say, from forestry to ag, or either ag back to forestry?
So that's where the devil is in the details. Ag to forestry is pretty easy, right? Because you're going from a use that requires an income stream. So going back to trees is easy. That's where the CRP program was so successful. Going from cropland to a horticultural crop may not be a problem if you can get strawberries in the first year. It's just a different use, right? But if you're growing peaches or any of the fruit trees or grapes, it's going to be tougher to get that income stream if that's the only use of the land. If it's a small tract and you're converting 100% of it. But by and large, the program's idea was to keep the land productive. So those minor switches may be, a few acres. That's not going to be a problem. And the income differential will be in terms of dollars per acre, not a big change. The big thing I'd suggest is to remember that these PUV clerks are busy and they don't like surprises. So if you're planning those things, let them know and they'll make that change. But as long as you're meeting that $1,000 income requirement, it shouldn't be a problem, except for the situations we talked about where you're converting a whole farm and you're going to lack that income qualification for those many years. So it could be that I'll just stop there because we can get into specifics. If you're going to take an acre out for a trailer or a house lot for your kids or a worker, just let them know about that and you can avoid at least this year's penalties or anything that you have occurring with that. So they make the change. There's no surprise, and you'll pay that differential, but they'll love you for it.
All right, Mark. Well, that's all the questions I see so far. I do want to thank you for being with us here this morning. Let everybody know we are recording this, and I am working on getting a resource page put together where we'll have all the recordings available. If you missed any of these sessions or any of the upcoming sessions you're not going to be able to make, we have those available. And I just want to thank everybody for being with us this morning. Thanks again, Mark.
Matthew, Mark, thank